And here we go. We're going to take a look at the world of intelligence, or as I like to call it, smartitude. This is actually being recorded in October of 2019 when Bolivia is on lockdown owing to irregularities and suspected fraud and potential massive protests concerning an election. So I might reference that throughout. If I happen to use this recording in future years at SCCS or even at other schools, just ignore all of that. Here's how I like to work these things. I ask you first of all, and this will be an assignment for 2019. I'll let you know if it's a future year. If it is, watch, go through, take notes. I will ask at some point either you to send me the notes or to take a look at them when we get back. As if you were in class and really trying to capture this stuff. These can be electronic or hand taken. I'm fine either way with that. Also, there are times in which I may say, wait, stop the video, make a response, answer the question, and then start again. Now, unfortunately, the school's totally uptight administrators are not allowing me to have cameras monitoring you in your rooms as you do this. I mean, I don't know if they're cheap or something about like, human rights or something like that, the right to privacy, whatever it is. It's not I can't make sure that you're doing that. But one of the things I really stress is that the more you are engaging with the information you're learning, the more you stop and think. You think of examples, you think about it before, the more deeply you process, the more you learn it. So we're going to begin right now with the intelligence true or false questionnaire. I would say stop the video right now and answer these 7 questions. Believe it or not, there actually is a small, not very heavy, like a 0.2 or something like that, correlation between head size and intelligence. Now, it's fairly minor. However, there is when it comes to brain size. I think the correlation last I had read was like 0.44. Not terribly significant, but not insignificant. Number 2, true. That's the Flynn effect. We've discussed that. 3, college grades are highly predictive of later work achievement. My recall is that that's not necessarily true. Now, it is true that high school grades definitely correlate with higher college grades, but once you get to a certain level of expertise, I believe the grades don't have a major influence on later achievement. Number 4, this is true. In fact, they've had an awful lot of success showing something new, a picture, a shiny object to a young child. And the more quickly the child looks at it and says, yeah, okay, great, I've done that. What else is there to engage with? Those who do that fairly quickly tend to score higher on intelligence test later. The kid that looks at the brand new picture and 4 hours later is still staring at it in fascination, that's an exaggeration, tends to score less well. Again, correlation. Men, yes, among the cognitively impaired, mentally retarded, much more common with men than with women. Yes, higher intelligence scores, more creative. Number 6 is probably a no within reason. One thing that we do understand is that if you have a particularly low intelligence score, you are in the low 90s, you're in the 80s or below, creativity is often a problem. You may not have the mental power to be truly, truly creative. However, if we're talking about creativity between a 107 and a 129, there doesn't seem to be much of a connection with higher intelligence and creativity. And certainly, obviously, number 7, when you grow older and grow up with adoptive parents, you become much more like your adoptive parents than your biological parents that you've never seen before? No. And this is one of the great mysteries. You actually, on average, tend to become more like the biological parents that you perhaps haven't seen in decades. Is that nuts or what? Now, St. Homer and intelligence. And yes, It did take me a few hours to figure out how to do that, so I hope you appreciated that. So standardization, basic vocabulary you need to know. What does a score mean? I often tell students about Stephen Oberly. I don't know who Stephen Oberly is, except apparently he was in my 4th grade class at Bluemont Elementary in Manhattan, Kansas. And I recall there being a big musical aptitude test. And they announced the whole school that Stephen Oberly had scored a 40. We thought, oh my God, he's terrible. He failed. They then went on to explain that that is the highest possible score. He's thought to have great aptitude for music. So what does it mean if you score a 93 on a test? Well, is it out of 400? What was the class average? If you score a 37 on the test and the class average is a 29, you did well. If you score a 37 and the class average was an 88, I would recommend coming to after-school review sessions. Reliability, we've talked about. Do you get similar results over time? And we saw this with the Boliviano note and measuring desks. They were reliable. 2 ways of doing this: test, retest. You do it a second time, usually not the exact same questions because then it's memorizing the answers, or a split test. You take 200 questions, you randomly divide it into 2. Are you doing equally well on both halves? Well, it's reliable. Validity means, does it test what it's supposed to do? Something I think that is not in the book is face validity. You may have heard the phrase, on the face of it, it looks to be valid. On the surface is what you're looking at. In other words, if I hand you a test for this unit and it's a bunch of chemistry equations, you would say, look, this is not a valid test. It is not testing my abilities of understanding of intelligence. On the face of it, on the surface, it's clear that it lacks face validity. Then there is content validity. The next test will involve research methods and intelligence. You look at it, you see a couple questions about Charles Spearman, etc., etc. You say, okay, on the surface, face validity, it's there. Wait a minute, there's not a single question about research methods. That is not accurately testing what it says it will. It's only telling us a part of what you've learned. And then predictive validity. What does it tell you about the future? So the goal is, if it's trying to say you will be an excellent college student, well, to what degree does it actually tell you about that future result? Yeah, and if you'll take a quick look here and determine which set of data results on the left or the right has more reliability. And it should be pretty clear. On the left, if you did poorly the first time, you did poorly the second time. However, here, Dawn had the lowest score. She had one of the highest scores, or in the middle the next time. So clearly, very little reliability on the right. Again, we've seen these numbers, and good to think about this if we are talking about reliability. Well, high correlation, it's fairly general. Once you get into that 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, you're talking pretty darn reliable. And criteria, or this is really predictive validity. I believe it's the same thing or very, very similar. Notice what we're looking at here. Scores on a pilot aptitude test. This test is supposed to indicate if you became a pilot, how good would you be at it? And you will notice on the left, very, very high predictive validity. Bob was expected to be terrible as a pilot. Bob got into a bloody crash his first time out. Dale was thought to be terrible. He was. Oh, but Anna and Kent, man, they were born to be pilots, and in fact, they had a stellar record. Over on the right, clearly, Kent was thought to be exceptionally strong at this, and again, the bloody crashes once again. So very little criteria or related or predictive validity on the right. Alfred Binet, an interesting character. A lot of this we could actually tie into world history, the idea of basic human rights and basic human equality. What you started finding is that in many Western countries, the United States, France, etc., that the idea would be that everybody has a right to an education. It shouldn't be just this elite thing. So the French school system in the late 19th century started having mandatory school attendance. Now, one of the things that Alfred Binet noticed is that the kids that came from rural areas, that came from poorer families, they just didn't tend to do as well in school. Um, but Binet never made an official statement as to whether or not he thought this was more genetic or more likely to be circumstantial, environmental, although he leaned toward environmental. So what he wanted to do was create a series of tests in which we could find out when people, young kids came to school for the first time, how were they doing? Not so much to label, in fact, very little to label people as, oh, you're not smart, you're not intelligent, but more to be able to say, wait a minute, who needs special help here? So what he did is he calculated the mental age of the students. And the whole idea was to help the underskilled. In other words, if I am 12 years old, but I'm functioning as a 9-year-old, well, that means I need special help. I'm not where I ought to be. Louis Terman came along a little bit later, a few decades later this would be, and creates the Stanford, that's the university's at Binet intelligence scale. He takes Binet's idea of mental age, divides it by chronological age, your actual birth certificate age, and multiplies it times 100. Terman, by the way, well, he's known for a couple things. One, he did a famous study of people with extraordinarily high IQs over time and found out that, in fact, the old stereotype that, oh, these people are disturbed and bizarre, actually, they ended up being, on the whole, very, very functional. They ended up being very successful, socially successful. There's relatively little question that a very high IQ is, in most cases, an advantage. Some later research has suggested that people that are just off the charts, we're talking 6 or 7 or 8 standard deviations above the norm. 6, 7, 8 would be the 190 to 220 and above range, that perhaps these people do have, on average, a little bit more of a social disability. Maybe they are so much faster, so much smarter, so much more able mentally and dexterous mentally that they're simply not able to, I guess, identify with other folks. But that's only at very, very, very extreme levels. Terman, by the way, I do want to mention this. Terman was also a strong believer in the idea of eugenics. And if you're not familiar with this, this was a very, very popular way of thinking, idea of genetically better, genetically worse populations. How do we maximize the number of genetically superior people populations, often affiliated with race? This was a very widely held belief in the United States, in the West in general, in the teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, etc. And if you say, gee, that sounds kind of like Hitler, well, in fact, yes, Hitler's theory, as it were, was based largely on the idea of eugenics. So obviously a fairly dangerous idea. About 60 years ago, David Wexler came along. There's an obvious problem, of course, with the intelligence quotient. I know more stuff than I used to know. However, I probably don't have a mental age that is 3 times higher than when I was 18. So whereas when I was 18, I might have had a mental age of 18 and a chronological age of 16, which would mean I'd have an IQ at that case of 112, it's unlikely today that my mental age today is 55. So I would suddenly become mentally retarded because my mental age has not increased as quickly as my chronological age. Wexler had the Adult Intelligence Scale, so the WAIS, W-A-I-S, and it was a series of pen and paper things, of analogies, logical reasoning, even taking geometric shapes and blocks and kind of moving them in the right direction. So here's what we call, well, first of all, that is a normal curve, you know it. This is something that people miss both on the test that I give and on the AP exam. You will notice that one standard deviation below the norm is an 85. All IQ tests, the standard deviation is 15. So between -1 and 1, because 100 is always the mean, 85 to 115 would be 1 standard deviation below to 1 standard deviation above. You'll recall that that would be 68% of the population. However, they have what they call the normal range, which is a little bit different. Basically, it's between 90 and 110. And if you think about it, that's a 20-point range as opposed to a standard deviation, which would be a 30-point range from -1 to 1. 20 divided by 30 is 2/3. 2/3 of 68 is about, very close to 50. In other words, half the population will fall between a 90 and a 110. Hence, that is called the normal range. And again, you need to know this. You need to memorize this. You need to be able for me to say, hey, everybody, stop. Draw a normal curve with all the percentage breakdowns and standard deviations for an IQ test. Go. And 5 seconds later, 5 seconds, that's ridiculous. 15 seconds later, you've got it. In other words, 0 standard deviations, that's a 100. It's always 100. These are re-standardized every time a new test comes out. A standard deviation is 15 points, so a 115. 34% of the population will score between 100 and 115. And another 14%, 13.6, but call it 14, will score between 115 and 130. So you may get questions. What percentage of the population falls between an 85 and a 130? And you'd have to do the math. 85 would be 34%, plus another 34% to a 130. So 34 plus 34 plus 14. The answer is 82%. But be at the point where you can just plain do this. You don't even have to think about it. It's muscle memory more than anything else. And that will certainly help you out on this test and probably come in very handy on the AP exam, to be sure. Notice that, by the way, once you get to 2 standard deviations above the norm, i.e. a IQ of a 130, well, we are moving into what we call gifted, extremely gifted, extraordinarily gifted. If we're getting on the other end, 2 standard deviations below the norm, we are talking retarded, cognitively impaired, and there are different levels going down in different directions the farther that you go down toward the left. IQ tests. First of all, if they are done, not if I gave you an IQ test in the room. I don't know how to give these. There would be all kinds of confounding variables, etc. But yeah, a professionally given IQ test, they are exceptionally reliable into the 90s, which is you can pretty much wind your watch by it, to use an old-fashioned metaphor. If you were to score a 124 on a professionally given IQ test and take one a year later, you would probably score within a few points either directions. Again, there can be unusual setups like you were outrageously drunk the first time, etc. But generally speaking, you have a sort of set IQ in terms of numbers. Validity. Yeah, again, this is tricky. Certainly, there is a positive correlation with school success. People with IQs in the 120s, they tend to be somewhat significantly more successful than somebody with an IQ of a 100, but that's not an absolute. Now, with the numbers of years in school going on to college, you're seeing a much higher validity. And in some ways that makes sense, because if you are more successful, you feel more capable, perhaps that's just something more meant for you. So, very reliable, reasonably valid. And then we have the extremes, mental retardation. And this is more often called cognitive impairment. It sounds a little bit less judgmental. Notice that IQ is a part of it for sure. However, the difference between somebody who may have a 68 IQ, which is technically below the line, but they've received all kinds of assistance, they are able to make up with this, they've learned skills, they're able to live on their own, they're slower but very, very functional, happy people. Well, that's hard to say that would be mentally retarded, whereas somebody with a 71 with absolutely no skill training is not. So it's not exclusively IQ. That's kind of a starting point. Um, there are different levels. If we are talking about mild, moderate, severe, profound, and these are basically all one standard deviation below. So 55 to 70, 40 to 55, 25 to 40, and profound below a 25. Mild is by far the most common. And again, causes, well, what's the answer? You know what the answer is. Both. Environmental, biological, both. So what we are seeing here, and again, maybe stop for a second, analyze this pie chart. It's the kind of thing that you'll need to do in your academic life, and tell me what you're seeing. Okay, I'm assuming you have restarted the video. Yeah, about 2 to 3% of the population would be considered cognitively impaired. Okay, got it. Now, among those who are cognitively impaired, you'll notice that close to 90% would fall in that 55 to 90 range. And as you get into deeper and deeper levels of cognitive dysfunction, you're seeing smaller percentages. This, to me, is one of the most single interesting charts that you will see in this class. I think it says so much. If you would stop for a moment and try to ascertain what is happening here. So what we are seeing here is if we're talking about IQs, we're talking about the unskilled labor. Now, this is somebody who would work lower wage jobs. This would be somebody that has no particular education or no higher education, limited training, etc. And generally, that's associated with poverty. I think relatively few people in this classroom really want to go into a career sweeping the streets, for example. You have other options, and good for you. You will take them. What do you notice about the number of cases per thousand of IQs in that moderate area, that mild area, that 60 to 69? It is really common, far more common, about 6 times more common than people that are coming, than you're seeing people that are profoundly mentally retarded or cognitively impaired. You will notice that as the skill label of the laborers, the education starts to grow, what happens to that mildly profound part of the population? It's halved when you see people with a certain amount of education. When you start seeing people that are actually pretty darn skilled, they may have been to a trade school, etc., it's much less common. And then you get into people that are professionals, you see very, very little of it. Now, you will notice that when it comes to profound mental retardation, that it stays fairly stable across income groups. Again, stop the video. Tell me, why do you think, or tell yourself, I'm not listening to you. Stop and tell yourself why you think this is. Savant Syndrome. I think you've already seen Kim Peek. Definitely recommend downloading, watching this film, Rain Man. It's a good film. Dustin Hoffman, my money, one of our great actors. Tom Cruise, I could normally do without him, although he was fantastic in a film called Magnolia. But plug for a couple of good films. Anyway, yeah, Savant Syndrome, remember, this is not a matter of, oh, Luciana, and I choose Luciana because there are a bunch of you, so it could be almost anyone. Luciana is really, really good in math, but oh, she's not very good in English. That is not Savant Syndrome. Savant Syndrome is like Kim Peek, absolutely cognitively impaired, IQ in the 40s or 30s or 50s, but absolutely stunning abilities in one particular or a few particular areas. And then giftedness. Again, we're talking about literally, if somebody is gifted, it is 2 standard deviations above the mean. So 100 is the mean. A standard deviation is always 15 points. So we are talking about an IQ of 130.
But again, you can't necessarily, well, first of all, the numbers are not precise, but what do we do if we have somebody who has a 131 IQ, no leadership skills, no particular talents that we can know of, not very creative? Do we call that person gifted, and somebody else whose IQ is 128 but is tremendously creative? Obviously, it's kind of a rough area, a rough line that gets drawn. Again, the stereotypes, oh my goodness, those who are gifted, those who are very intelligent, are physically weak, they can't form social skills, they have emotional issues. Lewis Terman studies a century ago really did contradict this. Again, I had mentioned earlier that when we talk about the profoundly gifted, IQ of 190, 200, 210, there sometimes are some problems, maybe more than average with these things. And again, I think the idea is they are just firing at such a different level than other people around them that they simply can't form the typical relations. But again, I want to point out that's an average, and that's not by any means, I mean, that's in general. Obviously, you'll find very, very many people who are profoundly gifted who don't have these issues at all. I want you to stop this and tell me, look at this for a moment, stop the film, and tell me, is this evidence for genetic cause of intelligence, or are we talking about environmental? Stop the video. And of course, once again, as always, it's both. Now, clearly, identical twins raised together, wow, a 0.85 correlation. That is really high. But you'll notice the same identical twins reared apart, raised apart. Clearly, being raised together does make a significant difference. So clearly, being identical twins, 100% genetic identically, plays a huge role in your intelligence. Your genetics do, but so does the environment. And you continue to look at this, and absolutely, genes matter, environment matters. Now, stop and ask yourself what heritability means. Actually, before you do that, what does heritability not mean? And then what does it mean? This is such an important concept. Stop the film for a second. Now, what heritability does not mean is what percentage of a trait is controlled by genes. It does not mean that. What it does mean is within a population, let's say it's 17-year-old Bolivians, when there are differences between two people or between people in a group with a certain trait, let's say intelligence, how much of that difference is due to genetic causes? If you have a heritability of 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, it would mean that if there is a difference between people in a population, a fair amount of that is probably due to genes. You'll notice that when we talk about intelligence, there's a lot of debate about this. Some would argue that when there's difference between two people in a group, that maybe as much as 70 or 80% of that variation is due to heredity, is due to genes. Again, that's not saying that 80% of your intelligence is due to genes. It does not mean that. If one Luciana has an IQ of a 120 and the other has an IQ of a 110, well, the high estimate would say that maybe 8 of those 10 points of difference are due to genes. Whereas others would say, look, absolutely, heritability is a factor when there is a variation in intelligence, but they believe it's probably closer to 40% or 0.4. But again, nobody is arguing 80% or 40% of your intelligence is due to genes. Nobody is arguing that. That is not what heritability states. It means, once again, I keep belaboring this because it's complicated, but it's pretty important, that when there is a difference within a population intelligence, it might be that genes have little to do with intelligence overall, Could be, who knows? But when there is a difference between two people in a population, how much of that difference is due to genetic causes? This is possibly my second favorite graph or image, certainly in this unit, and actually I might even think this is more important in a way. Stop for a minute and see if you can tell yourself, what is this graph showing us? Now, we should make the obvious point that this is simply just examples. One of the questions, though, and this is where the idea of genetic causes of intelligence, how much it's environmental, how much it's intelligent, ends up getting genetic, ends up being very, very political. Because you'll have people that say, look, intelligence and many other factors is largely about environment. We need to restructure our society to give all people access to education, to opportunity. We need to spend money to feed them, et cetera, et cetera. And others sometimes will say, look, it's entirely genetic. It really doesn't matter what we do in society. This really, I think, counters that last idea. So you are looking at people who are in an enriched environment. I mean, they're well fed. They go to good schools. They get whatever services they need. You could look at somebody like Tom, and Tom is genetically limited to a degree by in terms of intelligence. Look, the reality is that Tom was born with some disadvantages cognitively. However, if Tom is in an absolute terrible environment, gets poor schooling, gets no special help, Tom might actually top out at an IQ below 70, which would leave him cognitively impaired. As it is, with all these advantages, Tom finds himself topping out at an 84. Now, Tom would not be the quickest person in a classroom, but that's not that far. That's, hey, that's in the bottom 15 or 20% as opposed to the bottom 2%. You look at somebody like Kimberly. Kimberly, in a poor environment, well, she could end up with a slightly below average IQ. But the food, the medical care, the parenting, the education she got, she tops out as very capable. Looking at the bottom, hey, Alice came from a terrible environment. She didn't have good health care as a kid. She went to poor skills. But she was born biologically to be brilliant. As it is, her IQ tops out at a 125. Which again is probably higher than 95% of the population, or 94%. However, in the right environment, Alice could have ended up off the charts, a 1 in a million, 1 in a 10,000 form of intelligence. Jill had the ability to be every bit as strong as Kimberly in terms of her genetic makeup, but because of the poor environment, IQ is quite a bit lower. And Jack had the same opportunities as Tom, but is firing at a very low level, and that's about environment. So interesting. It would seem that even if you believe that intelligence is very much constrained by genetics, and to a degree it is, you're not going to find somebody barring a brain injury who has an extremely strong genetic makeup that would have an IQ of a 56 or something. But that difference between a 97 and a 115, or look, I'm sorry, Tom and Jack were never going to be gifted intellectually. They didn't have the genetic makeup, but the difference between an 84 and a 66, and that's created by environment, well, that's absolutely huge in terms of quality of life and contribution to society. This is where we get into real controversy. Look, there is a fact. I believe it's altered a little bit in recent years, but not a lot. White Americans generally score 10 to 15 points better than Black Americans on most intelligence tests. Some have argued, you know what, it's a genetic thing. Whites, Arthur Jensen, and a controversial book about 25 years ago, Herenstein and Murray's The Bell Curve, say, look, the reality is that people from white backgrounds, European backgrounds, simply have genetic advantages that people with an African background don't have. We'll take a look at some of these possibilities as to why this might be the case. One of them, of course, and this is actually, you will see this at some point. In fact, I think you already saw this in FRQ, stereotype vulnerability. In other words, if I come from a group in which I understand that it's common expectation that I will do worse than others because of who I am, yes, that can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't believe in my abilities because of the negative stereotypes around my type of people, hence I don't perform as well. Testing bias, we'll show you some examples of that in a moment. The Flynn effect, again, that can apply also to races. If, hypothetically, your typical white American were to have spent more time in better schools, taken 400 kind of standardized tests, where somebody from, let's say, a poorer background might have taken only 20 of these tests, perhaps that could have something to do with it. One thing that is key also, the concept of race as a social construct. Race doesn't really mean a lot. I mean, in terms of biology, there's no such thing as black blood, Hispanic blood, Asian blood. We understand that. There is also such an incredible degree of mixing. I look at my daughter to begin with. What is she? Is she white? Is she Asian? Well, what does that even mean? Given that my wife's family is from the Philippines, was there already quote unquote European blood in her? Certainly, if you talk about any African American in the United States, unless they've come over from Africa in recent decades, there is certainly going to be quote unquote white blood in them, European blood in them, because there is so much intermixing. The idea would be that race is not primarily biological as it is social. Again, I won't belabor the point, but heritability, amount of variation within a group raised under the same conditions that can be attributed to genetic differences. It absolutely cannot be used to compare different groups. So if anybody says intelligence is very heritable, hence whites are genetically superior to blacks or Asians are superior to whites, it simply is not a valid argument. It's not scientific. Again, you can look at this on your own for sure. All human qualities absolutely have a genetic influence without question. This is fairly famous. The idea, this is the cornfield analogy. And again, the idea that the same seed, a better seed, could go into a more fertile soil and could simply produce more, or the same seed could go into the more or less fertile soil and would simply produce more in the more fertile soil. And of course, the seed matters as well. That's really what we're looking at here. Yeah, take a look at this for a moment. Tell me how you would do on this intelligence test. Now, this is pretty outdated. This comes back from the 1940s and 50s when people were first starting to question, gosh, African Americans do really poorly on these IQ tests. They must not be as smart. Well, some began to argue that there is such a cultural bias to these exams. Let me tell you a classic example from the 1970s, and this was true. This is where you had to make analogies between words. And the fill-in-the-blank question, one very famous one, was cup and blank. Now, the correct intelligent answer was cup and saucer, because when you're drinking your tea from a teacup, you put it on a saucer, a little small plate that you put this on. And most middle class, upper middle class, largely white students got this correct. Turns out that in poorer communities, particularly poorer African American communities, the answer was most commonly given was cup and table. Because in reality, these kids did not come from families in which there was a cup and saucer tea set. That was not a part of their reality. Where do you put your frickin' cup? You put it on a table. Now, does that suggest that these people are less intelligent than those who got the right answer, cup and saucer? Of course, it does not in any way. So to belabor this point, a chitlin, by the way, is a traditional Southern African American food. It's sort of the intestines of various animals, pigs in particular. The idea was to give these questions using African American slang, African American realities, especially in the southern part of the United States, giving this to whites. Well, you would find out that the African American from Alabama would know what a handkerchief head is, would know what these words mean, would know what a gas head is, would know what Bo Diddley means. But of course, the whites taking the test would score very, very poorly. Is this evidence that African Americans are far more intelligent than whites? After all, no, of course, what this really means is IQ tests can be very culturally biased. And no, I don't know the answers to any of these. I'm not smart enough. Again, psychological order, the whole idea here. Well, you know what? This is actually kind of out of place. It's worth having a look at. Maybe I'll let you stop and take a look at it, but this doesn't deal so much with intelligence. In retrospect, I wouldn't have put this slide here. Again, brain size does correlate with intelligence. Now, it happens that Einstein's brain, which was actually transported across the country in the trunk of someone's car for study, wrote a famous report on that. Einstein's brain was not any bigger than average, although there were parts of the parietal lobe that were significantly bigger, an area that had to do with like spatial understanding. But generally speaking, yeah, there is a correlation. Bigger brain, more intelligence. It is a mild to moderate correlation. Notice that even with head size, there is a small correlation. That's not nothing, but it's not all that significant. One thing that seems to be true, higher intelligence scores does seem to correlate with more brain efficiency. One thing that we know on these tests is that if somebody is using 30% less glucose to perform a mathematical problem than somebody else is, well, that suggests probably that they have more glucose to use for other mental operations. In other words, higher intelligence scores. We also know that faster processing tends to score with higher IQ scores, tends to correlate. Now, again, these can be, well, simply how we define intelligence. And, we certainly know that there is an advantage on these tests for people that process very quickly. I have also known some students who are absolutely brilliant that don't necessarily process incredibly quickly, but they do it so effectively and methodically. So I think to some degree this might reflect on what intelligence is, but even more on what we deem intelligence. And obviously it's a science, but it's not a science. Faster, more complex brain waves correlate with greater intelligence. Ask yourself quickly, what type of brain scan would that use? Brain waves? Those would, of course, be an EEG, an electroencephalogram. What is intelligence? Spearman's G-factor, general intelligence. Some argue there is such a thing. Some say you can't do that. Intelligence is so diffuse. One thing that Spearman has noted, and this has been verified, those who are very, very strong in math academically tend to also be stronger in the language arts and history as well. You do certainly find people that are one or the other, but generally intelligence in one area seems to fit this. Will come Howard Gardner, Robert Sternberg will talk for a moment. I don't believe I had anything separate on emotional intelligence, EI. We'll talk about that later in the year. But the idea that your ability to control your emotions, to work with others, to live your life effectively is a type of intelligence that isn't really covered by the standard IQ test. Sternberg makes such sense to me. He talks about 3 distinct forms of intelligence, and this to me absolutely helps so many people. Practical intelligence, people that can get stuff done. It's not necessarily academic, but if you need somebody to figure out what to do on the spot, street smarts, there are people that seem to have that. Analytical intelligence. You know what? This is measured by IQ test. It's logical reasoning. I think you might call it book smarts. And then finally, creativity. People that can simply look at the same information and come up with different solutions than others might. insights, creativity, forming new relations. And here's an example coming up of how these three might be separate with different people. So Alice is a good student, gets good grades, although when she reached grad school, she had to come up with new ideas and started to fall behind. Barbara is not such a good student, but she's brimming over with new ideas for research. Celia isn't particularly creative and not a great student, but she's street smart. She knows how to get stuff done. Now, obviously, analytical intelligence is Alice, and Barbara is the creative intelligence, and Celia is practical. Sternberg does not say, though, that you're a finished product. Well, this is what you are. You're creatively intelligent, give up on the rest. He's saying is that you want to nurture all three of these, strengthen them all. You may have a natural strength, analytical, but how do you push yourself to become more creative, more practical, etc.? Makes a lot of sense to me. More well-known, and I have a little more skepticism about this, is Howard Gardner's distinct forms of intelligence. He came up initially, I believe, with 7. He then moved it to 8, and then it became, I believe now it's up to 10. And we'll take a quick look through these, although to be honest with you, in your textbook, I think they do a pretty good job of it. So I probably won't waste your time. Again, IQ tests, reading, linguistic. Logical, mathematical, also tested on IQ tests, analogies, math problems, logic. Spatial intelligence, the ability to figure out how things fit together. Can you take three-dimensional figures and form a cube of them? Musical intelligence, ability to perceive, create patterns of rhythms and pitches. Now, is this intelligence or is this just a skill that one has? And that gets debated. Bodily kinesthetic, and some say, well, that just means athletic. What does that mean? Although I think you can make an argument. In basketball, a point guard who can see the floor, can be thinking ahead, can contort his or her body, let's just say within a few millimeters to make the absolute perfect pass, etc. Gardner would say that that's intelligence. Others would say it's more a physical trait. Interpersonal. Inter means between, the international community. Being able to understand other people, form relations, to be able to connect with them. And then intrapersonality, knowing thyself. Really, this might possibly be as close to emotional intelligence as I can imagine. He has also since, by the way, added a biological or a naturalistic intelligence. In other words, your ability to understand natural systems out there, etc., to be able to communicate with nature, as it were. He's also, I believe, got something along the lines of a spiritual intelligence. Again, I don't know as much about these. I will tell you that Gardner was all the rage about 20 years ago. This is what we need to be doing in schools. There were Gardner schools set up where we tried to hone all these forms of intelligence. My understanding, though, is it is much less respected scientifically. Certainly, all of these are valuable skills that people have. We want to encourage the physical, the musical, the mathematical, the interpersonal, the intrapersonal, of course, but the evidence that this really is, these are all distinct forms of intelligence. They sound nice, but my understanding is that's been largely disregarded. Few IQ tests, again, these are only for fun. You absolutely can't, and honestly, these links might be broken. God knows how long ago I found these. But there are a whole bunch online. Use them at your own risk. Remember, if you're being told that you are severely mentally retarded, I'm pretty sure that you're not. Oh my God, I'm not emotionally intelligent, an EQ test. This is an informal way of doing this, but can be interesting to look online for some various forms of testing. A term that we will talk about a lot, reification, sometimes pronounced reification. You know what I think we've even used this in class before. But for example, if I were in the room with you and I asked you to give me a pencil, you could pick up a pencil and give to me. If I asked you to point to a light, you would point up at the ceiling, at a light. If I were to ask if I could borrow some courage, you would stop and say, wait a minute, courage? What? You don't know what courage is? Well, yeah, I know what courage is, but you can't touch courage. You can't see courage. This is exactly what reification is. Taking an abstract concept, something that doesn't physically exist, that you can't see, touch, throw, etc., and then turning it into something that does exist. We all know what intelligence means. We understand what intelligence is, but we can't touch it. We can't feel it. We can't give it to somebody else. So intelligence, yes, we all understand what the basic concept of intelligence is, but it's not an actual real physical item. And finally, we will stop with Tom the Dancing Bug. I like this cartoon. Hey kids, interested in science? Here's an experiment you can try. There's a current scientific theory that because on average whites score 15 points higher than blacks on IQ tests, they are inherently genetically smarter than blacks. Well, let's test that theory. Wait a minute, can you do an experiment with this? Maybe we can. Here's the experiment. Kidnap a bunch of white Americans and send them over to Africa on a slave ship. 2. Force them and their descendants into slave labor for about 100 years. Oh, make sure to break up families and disallow education. 3. Then set them free, but subject them to horrific discrimination and oppression for another century or so. 4. Give them IQ tests that are designed by privileged black Americans. If they still score 15 points higher than blacks, you've proven the hypothesis. Have fun, kids. Oh, and remember, get your parents' permission before doing the experiment. Right, so I think this is what you largely need to know about intelligence. Again, you've read your textbook, you have your review book, there are the numerous online sources. There's the Philip Zimbardo Discovering Psychology series, has a whole episode on intelligence, and this. So yes, watch this. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have questions, of course, write them down when we get back to class, or absolutely be glad to carry on email communication with you as well. All right, folks, enjoy your day.